All right. Now you can't avoid my voice. Wow. All right. I get applause from one guy in the front. Thank you so much. Now everyone. Wow. Courtesy is contagious. Don't let them vaccinate you for that. All right. Everyone, it's so wonderful to have spent this weekend with you all. Thank you so much for being here with us for our Saturday night dinner at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum. First, a few announcements. Some very good news. The bar is moving into the room with us. It's going to be at the back of the room. That means that the bar will be available until 8:30 for those of you who would like to grab a drink. Please feel free to do so. And until 8:30. So we got another hour on booze. So please enjoy that. And then after you have adequately liquored yourself up and your wallet's feeling a little loose, there is bidding going on still on the centerpieces at all of these tables. These wonderful custom design centerpieces are available. Glenn Jacobs has put his bid down. You've got to beat him. And then you get to brag that you beat Glenn Jacobs. Who doesn't want to brag about that? Because you know you couldn't beat him in the wrestling ring. So you can beat him at bidding for centerpieces. Go home proud. I want to say a few thank yous. First, I want to say a thank you to the two lovely ladies who have really led the charge on organizing the Liberty Forum this year, to Tammy and Marion. Could we give them a round of applause? I would say that it's a thankless job, except that we're thanking them right now. So thank you to you both. And thank you to all of the volunteers who've contributed to making this such a wonderful event. This is a volunteer-powered event, and we couldn't do it with everyone chipping in their time and their energy. And another round of thank yous I want to give to folks who I, on top of everyone else, I don't think have been properly thanked for all their hard work, and that's the hotel staff who are serving us. Thank you to all of you for taking good care of us, keeping us fed, keeping us taken care of. Thank you. We've had a very warm welcome. All right. And before I introduce, now, of course, we're all looking forward to our keynote speaker tonight, Glenn Jacobs. But Glenn Jacobs is such a larger-than-life figure that I am introducing the guy who's going to introduce him. All right? But before I get to that, I did just want to acknowledge there was as a state senator from the state of Maine, and to all the legislators who might be in the room today, there was a big holiday yesterday that I just don't want to go by without being acknowledged. We've all survived the Ides of March. Give ourselves a pat on the back, right? As a senator, I'm always watching out, you know. Never know. Oh, here's a knife. Okay. All right. But in all seriousness, so let me introduce our the next person who's going to be coming up to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening. I am so excited to introduce my friend, a man who I consider to be one of the most persuasive people in the liberty movement over the decades at particularly convincing conservatives that they're really libertarians, if they just think about it. When I was younger, I am pained to admit that I was a bit of a neoconservative. I believed in the wars, and I thought George W. Bush was great. It's embarrassing to admit. But you know, we all start somewhere. It's the journey we go on in life. And thankfully, I had an older brother who was a big Ron Paul supporter who kept throwing YouTube videos at me by this particular guy. And I'll always remember he had one video, where he talked about, as conservatives, right, we recognize that, like, the Department of Education, right, it's terrible, the Department of Education. It's a big government bureaucracy. It wastes billions and billions of dollars, and it doesn't actually make children's education better. It makes it far worse, right? And that's what government bureaucracy is, right? Right. And then he said this one thing, and it just blew my mind. And he said, so where is the magical fairy dust we sprinkle over the Department of Defense that makes it anything different? So that man was Jack Hunter, and he's here with us this evening. This is Jack Hunter's, believe it or not, it is his very first New Hampshire Liberty Forum. How is that possible? For all of his years in the New Hampshire Liberty Movement, he was Ron Paul's 2012 campaign blogger. He co-wrote with Senator Rand Paul, The Tea Party Goes to Washington. And he also co-authored our keynote speaker Glenn Jacobs' book, Mayor Kane. Yeah, we can give him a round of applause for that. Why not? He is, I truly believe, and of course he's a perfect match for Glenn to co-author a book with him, because not only does Jack Hunter care very passionately about liberty politics, but for those who know Jack, he cares just as passionately about professional wrestling. So I'd like to welcome up my good friend Jack Hunter to come speak with us. Jack, thank you for converting me to libertarianism, and we're so honored to have you here with us this evening.
Appreciate it. Absolutely. Thank you. You're overselling me. You're too kind, Eric. It's good to see a lot of old faces in here tonight, and a lot of people I haven't met. It's fantastic. You and everybody else. What's that? I don't know. I think you look pretty good, Marion. So, believe it or not, with this accent, I'm not from this area. I know that's very surprising. But I did, in the mid-'90s, live in Woburn, Massachusetts for about 3 years. Yeah, exactly. Massachusetts, all that. I was in 1920s, very young. But when I think of New Hampshire, I think of a couple things first. First and foremost, being a libertarian for a good while now, I think of the Free State Project, all the great work you've done for over 2 decades and continue to do. I also think of the fact that I was a young man who liked cigars and would leave Massachusetts and cross the New Hampshire state line where the taxes were much lower. That's something I think about. I did that back in the day. I think about that was the age I started getting interested in politics, and Pat Buchanan won the 1996 New Hampshire primary, making me an anti-war conservative who would later become an anti-war libertarian when Ron Paul was on the scene in a big way in 2008. But one of the top things I think about, being an uber wrestling fan who likes it as much or more than politics sometimes, and being a big fan of Kane and Stone Cold and The Rock, is finding out that one of those dudes was a Ron Paul guy. I was like, what? Really? So the first time I ever heard Glenn Jacobs talk about politics was on Free Talk Live with Mark Edge, who I met for the first time tonight. And I'd seen Kane kick everybody's ass. Exciting, it's good, the promos shooting fire, but I was really interested in hearing what he was going to say about libertarian politics and Ron Paul. You probably don't even remember this. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. You talked about Murray Rothbard, talked about the non-aggression principle, but all these things. But as a libertarian, I was like, man, this is the coolest thing in the world. And, WWE was really hot at the time, and a lot of people who didn't know about libertarianism or things like that knew that Kane was that. Ron Paul's running for president, and we know what Ron Paul did as far as getting people interested in this. A celebrity at the level of Vince Vaughn, who was on board with Ron Paul, and certainly Kane in the WWE, that was all part of that package and should never be overlooked. So Ron Paul brings people together, brought Glenn and I together. We've been friends for, 13 years now. The first year of that friendship, and he's heard this before, I'm just sitting there going, I'm talking to Kane. This is crazy. I'm talking to Kane, and he's saying stuff, and I'm trying to listen, but I'm just like freaking out the whole time. And I'm trying to be cool, but that's what it was. A year later, and I didn't even talk about wrestling. I was like, this is all libertarian politics, right? I got to be cool. year after that, we're actual friends in a real way and are comfortable and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things I learned is Glenn is not only one of the smartest guys, he's one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. And anybody will tell you that. I'll go further. Anybody in the wrestling industry, I'm just a fan. I listen to podcasts. I read interviews. To a man, to a woman, they all say he's the nicest guys in the world in a business that's not always so very nice. And he's laughing, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. But that counts. I think that movements are most successful when they are about figures. That doesn't mean they're not about ideas, but there needs to be somebody who personifies the ideas. An example would be, I don't think we would be having as serious a conversation about socialism in the United States the last few years if not for the Bernie Sanders campaigns and the existence of AOC. I think that's just a fact. I don't think that libertarianism would have exploded as much as it did a decade ago if Ron Paul hadn't ran for president. And if we didn't have Rand Paul as part of that legacy, Thomas Massey, Justin Amash, I would throw Judge Napolitano in there, Tom Woods, people like that. But among those figures, those faces for what we believe in, and I think that's very important, Glenn Jacobs is one of those and continues to be, and I think that's very important. So, without further ado, some people call him Mayor Kane. You get called that sometimes. Some people just call him Kane. I just know him as Glenn. So, ladies and gentlemen, the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, and one of the best libertarian representatives we could ask to have, Glenn Jacobs.
Thanks, Jack. That was an incredibly gracious introduction. And Eric, that was an incredibly gracious introduction of Jack. So I'm trying to figure out who I'm going to introduce next. And thank you very much, but trust me, I'm none of those things, but thank you for saying all that. Being here brings back some wonderful memories for me. Not all of them pleasant, actually. No. So the 2008 Liberty Forum, I spoke at that event, yes. And it's funny because some of the guys are saying it was great, a very educational, erudite speech about economics. And I'm going to talk about politics. It will not be that smart, trust me. Hopefully entertaining. But nevertheless, I will never forget. It might have been in this room, actually. And David Nolan kicked the whole thing off, right? And I will never forget, this is like the first big-time political speech I'd done, right? And David Nolan's talk was titled Freedom in the Age of Obama or something like that, right? So he said he's looking at the program and he comes across this speech by some dude that's talking about liberty's going to win. Oh my gosh, how is that going to happen? Well, that was my speech. Yep, and David Nolan, who invented the Nolan chart and who is one of the founders of the Libertarian Party, literally one of the fathers of the modern libertarian movement. And I'm sitting there going, oh, this is great. And I felt like I was about that tall. Actually, afterwards, though, he was very gracious and came up to me after my talk and was very complimentary and said I did a good job. The thing about it, he wasn't wrong. I mean, you think about those days, 2008, and where our country was compared to now, and I think a lot of us would argue that we're in an even much worse place than we were back in 2008. But I wasn't wrong either, because I'm talking long term. And what will the liberty movement look like? What will the impact that we do today, what will that have on the future of our country, really on the future of the world? 2008, also, the keynote speaker was a guy named Ron Paul. Yeah. Now, I actually came to Ron Paul through the libertarian movement, okay? A lot of folks discovered liberty, or discovered discovered liberty through Ron, and I was already on that path, and then I started hearing about this crazy congressman from Texas, and I listened to some of the stuff he was saying. In fact, the first time I ever actually saw or heard Ron Paul was a documentary that John Stossel had done called Mr. Stossel Goes to Washington. And he interviews Ron, and I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, he's saying everything I think, right? So, but to see him, and I think it's true for a lot of us, to see him in person, I don't really get starstruck. I'm just not that. And, I've been around a lot of famous people, and a lot of them, obviously, they're just like everybody else, right? There's good ones and there's bad ones. But the first time I ever met Ron Paul was actually in Nashville, Tennessee. And when he walked in the room, I felt like Thomas Jefferson had just entered, right? I mean, my knees literally got weak, right? So to be here, it was just heady times. I mean, he is making a huge impact running for president, okay? Looked like he actually could have won. And it was awesome because you're watching the news and, so-and-so came in first in this primary and this dude came in third. Who came in second? Or, don't worry about that primary. Well, who won? No, don't worry about it. And it showed everybody, that there was, on really both sides of the political aisle, they wanted to shut this guy up because he was talking about things that the Uniparty, which existed back then, has existed for a long time, they didn't want anyone to hear about it. He was talking truth to power. Had a huge impact on me. Well, fast forward to 2012, and he runs for president again, and things happened at the RNC, like the delegates for Ron weren't allowed in the building, just all these horrible things that happened. And that completely turned me off of electoral politics. I mean, I was done. Because how is it you have this guy who has a huge grassroots movement, a quality human being, and you won't even let him talk, okay? Because his ideas are so dangerous, but they're the ideas that this country was founded on. But you don't want to talk about that. So, I mean, I was done. I was checked out. I was still involved, but I never, ever, ever wanted to run for office, right? Yeah. And then I saw Jason Osborne earlier, and I was like, how did the two of us end up in elected office? But nevertheless. So then one day I was on the Tom Woods show, and I basically said, look, I'm done. And I think electoral politics and public office, I just don't think it's effective, and I just don't think that's the way to go. And Tom said, and he interviewed me not that long ago and asked me about running for office. I was like, it's your fault. He's like, what do you mean? It's like, because his response to me, and he was right, he said that, well, that's great, but 300 and some odd million people in the United States are probably not going to suddenly withdraw their consent from the federal government. So we need everything, not just elected office holders, activists, educators. We need the whole package because all of those things have an impact in their own way. So I got to thinking about stuff and where I was in my life. I was coming to the end of my wrestling career and knew that I was going to have to do something different. And again, I had never contemplated running for elected office. In fact, I think, I told a lot of people that I would never, ever do that. My wife never thought I was going to do that. That was an uncomfortable conversation. But I got to thinking, where could I be most effective for this movement? The reason all this is so important to me is I grew up in very rural Northeast Missouri. My dad is retired military. He spent 21 years between the Navy and the Air Force. We didn't have much when I was growing up. We weren't poor or anything like that. Because of Dad's military retirement, we always had a place to live and something to eat. But it was a rough time. I grew up in the 1970s. The country was not doing well economically. Where we were, there just wasn't a whole lot of economic opportunity. Dad worked in factories, but if he got laid off, things would get real tight. Unexpected expense would come along, like the car breaking down or something like that, and things would get super, super tight. For me, I didn't want to, when I grew up, I didn't want to think I'm working so hard like my mom and dad did, but we're just barely getting by. Right? We're just barely keeping our heads above water. I thought that my pathway to success would be through professional sports. Long story short, I blew out my knee playing college football, missed an opportunity to play in the NFL. However, I was able to use my body, my athletic skills, to parlay that into a career in professional wrestling, which I hadn't really thought about when I was much younger. I always wanted to play baseball or football or basketball, but I was able to take that and provide a living for my family that I would have never thought possible. I traveled the globe. I worked with some of the greatest entertainers on the planet, performed in front of millions of people live and on TV. And I think about the trajectory of my life, and I'm like, how is it that someone like me that grew up 5 miles outside of a town of 350 people with no family, didn't have any, not much money, no political connections, no business connections, nothing. And how is it that someone like me could be incredibly blessed to live the life that I've led? And I believe the reason is because in this country, we have this thing called the American dream. It's the most exceptional and important thing about America. And anyone, if you figure out what your talent is and you're willing to work hard and apply that, you're willing to create your own opportunities, man, the sky is the limit. Anyone can do pretty much anything, right? And I've traveled the world. That is not the case everywhere. It's just not. And we are so incredibly fortunate to have that here, and we take it for granted. You guys don't, but a lot of folks do. So for me, I'm thinking about what kind of world are my kids and my grandkids going to inherit? Are they going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that I had? That's what it's all about. So then silly me decided to get into politics, right? So the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, Tim Burchett at the time, who is now our U.S. congressman, who's actually one of the good ones up there. He was term limited, so I had a chance to run, and it's like, what the heck? I'll do that. And I ran. One of the most important things, and again, all of us working together, is in my campaign, we actually invested most of our money in a grassroots effort led by door knockers from Young Americans for Liberty. So, and one of them is right here. Keith, Keith, stand up for a second. So we had 7 people come to Knox County. I think they spent 6 weeks in the county. We knocked on 55,000 doors, most of it by them, okay? Well, Keith didn't. He's productive, but I don't think he got 50,000. We're a very Republican county. Primary night comes. I won by 23 votes out of 40,558. But I'm still a little upset with you some days because I did win, and I'm always like, is that congratulations or condolences? Nevertheless, all of a sudden I find myself as mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. We're a community of 500,000 people. We are the 3rd largest county in the state of Tennessee, and we are the largest conservative/Republican county in the state of Tennessee. So when I get into office, I think I'm going to do what all good libertarian conservative folks do. I'm going to keep taxes low, try to cut regulations, just keep government off of our backs, right? That was my main thing. That was going along really, really well. And then 2020 hit. Yeah. So I first started hearing about this coronavirus thing actually in December of 2019. I'm reading news articles about a coronavirus in China. And I'm like, ooh, that sounds a little scary. But I actually talked with some of our public health people, and this is awesome because they told me that the World Health Organization was taking a lot of flack because they were praising China's response to the coronavirus. It wasn't COVID-19 yet. They didn't have a name for the disease. It was still coronavirus. But they were taking a lot of flack because their response was to lock the country down, right? Here's the kicker. I was told, but we can't do that because they're a communist country and we're not. 4 months later, things changed quite a bit. So I'm watching this, and I talked to some folks, and this will be around for 6 months or so, the pandemic, like the bird flu and swine flu, but it'll be a pain, they'll be fine, right? Well, then things start really deteriorating, and you guys know the story. I mean, it went from, in March of 2020, it went from Anthony Fauci. Can I hear a boo, please? Thank you. But it went from Anthony Fauci literally saying this is no big deal to like 2 weeks later, oh my God, we're all going to die, okay? And I do not mean to make light of COVID-19 because it was a serious health issue. But in my opinion, it was used to instill the biggest growth of government that we have seen in this country, and it's a sledgehammer against our civil liberties. So when they first started talking about lockdowns, we actually had a spat of suicides in Knox County. We had 10 suicides in like 3 days, which was an astronomical number. I said, well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that we are telling people who might be on the edge of suicide anyway that you're going to have to sit in your house alone and you're going to lose your job. Maybe it has something to do with that. Well, it's funny because our newspaper of record runs this story later that week. Jacobs blames COVID lockdowns on suicides, but data does not back him up. And the reason they said that was because most of these folks had not left suicide notes. The thing is, most victims of suicide do not leave suicide notes to begin with. So my statement was simply based on the fact of you have a condition, you change a variable, you have an outcome. Maybe the variable is what caused the outcome to happen, all right? So we start moving forward. We're talking about lockdowns. We're talking about safer at home orders. I'm looking at what's going on around the country. Our governor, Billy is a great guy. He's actually one of my favorite people. He's a really good guy, got a great heart. At one point, he issued he had a safer at home order, not an order, advisement. And that was always my stance as well. It's like, look, you can ask people to do stuff. You can advise them to do stuff. Do not mandate that they do these things, right? So the governor, though, goes from a safer at home advisory to a shelter in place order. When he did that, well, I put out a video. And I said, yeah. And I didn't lambaste him. I mean, I just said, I strongly disagree with this, okay? In our country, we have this thing called the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment prohibits the authorities from unreasonable searches and seizures. Out of the Fourth Amendment, we have the implication that's where we say that we get to travel freely because the cops can't just stop you for any old reason. Well, you're violating the Fourth Amendment because if anyone leaves their house, now you can arrest them or detain them or whatever, right? So I make all these points in the video. Then the really great thing happened was then I learned he was actually coming to Knoxville the next day. But he is a class act. He's a good guy, and he actually didn't. No. We didn't even talk about it, and he understood. We just disagreed on this certain issue, right? Well, again, I'm thinking, okay, we got 15 days to flatten the curve. Well, then it went to 30 days to slow the spread. And I'm like, gosh, this is going to stop at some point. Go back to March, though, in late March. Remember my communications director's like, they just canceled March Madness. And I'm like, they canceled March Madness? How do you cancel a month? But they did, the basketball tournament, obviously. And I'm like, ooh, I think this is really bad, right? And just kept on going. So, not to get in the weeds, but the governor started doing executive orders. And again, everybody was scared. I get it. And he was a lot lighter than many of the governors around the country. Even DeSantis, and people say DeSantis was so great during COVID, and he was later that year. But during the start, that's what everybody was doing because everybody was scared to death, right? So I was one of the people saying, we can't do this, okay? As bad as this disease might be, we're destroying this country. And ultimately, that would be the worst possible outcome of the whole thing, right? So anyway, the governor's issuing executive orders, and in Tennessee, we have 95 counties. 89 of them have health departments that are run by the state. 6 of them have their own health departments. However, the public health officer is actually still part of the state in those 6 independent offices, right? The 6 independent counties. So what happened was the governor would issue these executive orders for the other 89 counties, and then he would allow the 6 that had their own public health officer to do their own thing. Well, that sounds great, right? Except then I learned that the mayor was not in charge. We had this board of health that no one had ever heard about before. Yeah, and their job was actually just to review the health department's budget, right? And that was it. They would just have essentially perfunctory meetings and approve the budget and everything's fine. Well, all of a sudden, these people got legislative power. And they started making all these rules. And I sit on the Board of Health, right? But I'm the one vote. There were like 9 members. So they have all this authority to do these things in the name of public health. So they did things like mask mandate. I voted no. Yeah, no, it's terrible. And it was really cool because our sheriff, who's a good friend of mine, good guy, the news interviewed him after that meeting, and the sheriff's like, I'm not going to enforce that. So, yeah. So, then they start shutting down. They start shutting down businesses, and it's funny because businesses are calling me. It's like, what should we do? I was like, brother, I don't care what you do. Just kind of keep it on the lowdown, okay? But I'm not going to tell anyone to shut down. So all these things are happening. I'm the one person on the Board of Health that is voting no for everything, basically. Yeah, thank you. And then because of that, I'm accused of murdering grandma. I was. I mean, it was awful. There was so much vitriol. And it was like, you're putting profits over people. You're putting the economy over people. I'm like, the economy is people. We're depriving people of their ability to make a living. Well, then Washington just prints a bunch of money and sends them $1,300 checks, which actually turned out to be the most expensive check that most people ever get because it drove inflation through the roof, right? So all these things are happening. I am just trying to do my best to kind of push back and hold the line. We'll tell you this funny story. I was going to tell Gard and Mark and kind of got distracted before he came in. So we had this one Board of Health meeting, and we would do them over Zoom because all the Board of Health was made up of doctors, and I'm sure they're really nice people and everything. The problem is they can never take off their hat as a doctor, someone's personal physician, in which case it's okay to say, look, you need to do this. But when you're making public policy, you can't think like that. You can't think of, I'm the authority and I'm going to tell you what to do or else. You have this thing, we have this thing called the Constitution. We have a Constitution in Tennessee too. We have a charter in Knox County. You're supposed to abide by all those things. They didn't care. In fact, the do something gene that infects so many politicians hit them too. Because at one point we were talking about something, they're like, well, people expect us to do something. And I was like, well, refraining from doing anything is doing something. That didn't really fly. So anyway, one night we have this is awesome. One night we're having a Zoom meeting, right? And it went pretty well. They didn't talk about anything crazy and get to the other business part of the meeting. Now, any of you that have ever been in government meetings realize when other business comes up, generally the meeting's over and you can leave. Whew, okay. So, does anybody have any other business? And one of the doctors chimes in on Zoom and she says, well, I've been getting a lot of emails from employees at gentlemen's clubs. Yeah, and I'm like, now, what you guys have to understand is my sense of humor has never matured past the 12 years old, right? I'm Beavis and Butthead when it comes to that stuff, right? So I'm sitting there on my camera, and I'm doing we're going to talk about strippers. So what had happened was they had a curfew on bars. Okay, so bars had to close at whatever time. But in Tennessee, or at least in Knox County, the adult cabarets are BYOB. So they're not bars. So they got to figure out what to do with the strip clubs. And so I'm sitting there, I'm about to die laughing. I'm trying to hold it all together. And one of the other doctors, and I have my Zoom set up so that like your face gets real big when you're the person talking. All of a sudden her face is filling my computer screen. And she says, how do we make them wear masks? And I went, they don't wear clothes. But here's the kicker. And see, this can only happen to me, right? The next week, out in front of City Hall, there was one of the employees at one of those establishments wearing her outfit, holding a sign that said, my ass has rights too. And I was like, yeah, that could only happen in Mayor Glenn Jacobs' tenure, right? So then Deborah Birx comes to Knox County. Yeah, she's another one, right? And here's the thing. We all blame Fauci for all this stuff. And Fauci, yes, he is a scoundrel and should be held accountable, and thank God Rand Paul is trying to do that. However, Fauci was the face of the COVID response. Deborah Birx was the architect of the COVID response. And if you've ever read Dr. Scott Atlas's book, A Plague Upon Our House, he does not have very nice things to say about her, all right? And she's dumb. I will just say that because I met her in person. So she comes to Knoxville, and the local media, of course, is like, oh, my God, things are so bad that Deborah Birx is here. Well, all it was a routine deal. She was visiting all of the SEC, the Southeastern Conference schools. So she'd been in like Alabama and Kentucky and was just coming here. But they were making this big deal out of it, like she was going to come solve all our problems and COVID was going to leave when she did, if only. So we're like in a room this size at the University of Tennessee, one of their conference rooms. There's maybe 20 people in it. Everybody in that room, with the exception of me, has a PhD or an MD, okay? Pretty smart crowd, right? And we're all wearing masks, and we're all like this far away from each other, right? And then the best part, and this part I love, though, when someone would talk wearing their mask, you couldn't hear them. So they would pull the mask off to talk. And I'd be like, well, that's supposed to be blocking spittle, I guess, but you're all over me now. Anyway, so Birx says, they ask her for recommendations about what we should do. And, of course, my recommendation was like, she needs to leave. But they asked for recommendations for what we should do. And she said, you need to close all your bars and restaurants. Now, to their credit, someone raised their hand, took off their mask, and said, well, Dr. Birx, the data shows, or the data doesn't show, that this is spreading at bars and restaurants. Folks, you want to know the core behind the government's COVID response? Was her reaction. She said, yes, that's true, but we need to show people this is serious. It was a PR campaign. That's all it was. And then if you read Atlas's book, you realize, I do have access to data that probably most people don't, and I get a lot of numbers and I can pull things. We thought that was what the government was doing, right? What Birx is doing. She wasn't. She was pulling publicly available reports and then extrapolating that out in her models, but not taking into account anything, such as what people were doing on their own, whatever. Basically, she was using a linear extrapolation to say, this is how many people are going to die if we don't do this, and it was all bogus. But it was also a giant PR campaign. And really the whole thing was about, to me anyway, in the end, it was about organizations like the CDC and the NIH vastly expanding their fiefdoms and inflating their budgets, and they were doing so at the expense of Americans' liberty, freedom, and lives, frankly. Because as bad as COVID was, and it was bad, I am firmly convinced that lives could have been saved if we'd done something like follow the Great Barrington Declaration and looked at focus protection instead of doing what we did, which was just pure tyranny, right? So things move forward, everybody gets tired of all the stuff, and finally the governor gives the mayor the authority. And it was so funny because the other counties, the big counties, had mask mandates, and this was like late April, and the governor's like, I want all the mask mandates lifted by May, right? By the end of May. Well, obviously, as soon as he wrote that executive order which gave me the authority back, bam, all that stuff was gone. Mask mandate's gone, it's gone. And it was funny because there was a radio talk show host that said, well, the governor said the end of May, Jacobs must have heard the end of the day. So things are getting better. We're in the clear. Our school board has the issue of mask mandate come up. They vote it down twice. Then they end up in federal court, where a judge issued an injunction saying that Knox County schools had to forcibly mask their kids, their administrators, and their students. 58,000 kids in our schools. I mean, and we never really shut the schools down like other places did. But nevertheless, so now you have a federal judge saying that you have to do this, and he used the ADA as his rationale, right? And he even said in his opinion that he was contemplating using the ADA in a way never done before. And I'm like, yeah, jackball. What you're doing is you're basically, the ADA has always applied to physical facilities, such as wheelchair ramps, such as doors being wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs, such as handicap bathroom stalls. Well, now what he was saying is the government has a requirement to regulate behavior. So needless to say, he and I got into a bit of a war of words. Then I teamed up with one of our state representatives and an organization, an extremist organization called Moms for Liberty. And we ended up, I gave them money and promoted their lawsuit, but they ended up doing a countersuit saying what the judge had not contemplated was the harm being caused to some of the students, because he basically said this is no big deal. It's funny, I had a friend of mine that I hadn't heard from for a long time, and for some reason, I'm tweeting all this stuff, and for some reason he sends me a text and he's like, bro, I love you, but there's no proof that masks don't hurt kids. I'm like, oh really? Why don't you answer the phone and talk to the mom whose kid can't go to school because they have severe eczema and the mask makes them break out, and they were devastated because they couldn't go back to school, right? Why don't you talk to them? Why don't you talk to all the kids who have speech impediments and speech problems and are going to fall behind because guess what? They can't see their teacher enunciate. Why don't you talk to them, right? So then this goes on, and finally, it all goes away. But the judge did say that was a political stunt on my part, and it was not a political stunt. I was deadly serious. He was hurting our kids, and it was stupid. And the masks don't work anyway. So there's that. So anyway, we move through all of these things, and finally, we get back kind of on to an even keel in Knox County. Right? Now I look back on that, and I think that was only 3-4 years ago. But it's like so many people have forgotten what went on during COVID, and they would just rather put it behind them as opposed, yeah, let's move on, right? Well, the problem with moving on is that we're going to face another crisis. Probably something worse. I would say we're going to have an economic collapse at some point, the way they're spending money at this point. What happens when the same people who pushed all this COVID tyranny, and we didn't push back as hard as we should have? I think they're going to do it again, right? And that's really, to me, the lesson of all of that, is we can never, ever let anything happen like that in this country again. I had one of my fellow county mayors, when all this was kicking off, I'll never forget this. And he's not a libertarian, good dude, good conservative, but not necessarily a libertarian. And we were talking, he's like, Glenn, I got all these people demanding that I take their rights away. And he's like, people have fought and died so they could have those rights. And now we just so easily give them up. We can never, ever do that again. But the reason I got in that spot was basically because of you all, Young Americans for Liberty, right? Again, not necessarily thrilled about that. But here's the thing. It actually, what I did, and I was just doing my job. I'm not bragging. Okay, I was just doing what I thought was right. But it went well beyond Knox County. I was talking with a district attorney from like 3 counties over, and he told me that his office was looking at what I was doing, and also Andy Ogles, who was mayor of Maury County, is now in Congress, and what we were saying, and he was like, we decided we weren't going to prosecute anybody for violating public health orders, right? So because of what I did, and because of the stand that I took, it radiated well beyond Knox County. In fact, I was talking with a state senator was introducing me at something the other night, and he said it actually influenced what they were doing, because they had enough cover to say, well, the crazy mayor in Knox County thinks this way, so we need to start reversing some of these things. 500,000 people live in Knox County, but our MSA is over 1 million people. Those 1 million people, because I was sitting in that seat, and pretty much no one else would have done this. Those 1 million people were freer throughout COVID, and they are freer and in a better position now because I was able to push back against all those things. And again, that's not bragging. That's not bragging. I did my job, and that's the result, right? Our country is headed in a very bad direction. We all realize that, okay? But what you do has an impact. Because I sat in that seat, 1 million people benefited, right? Because of what you're doing here, people benefit. And what happens in the future, we have the ability to impact that, to benefit people, okay? There is a concept in evolutionary biology called punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium says is that, when we think about how things are going and it just kind of follows this linear path. And punctuated equilibrium, which is actually a much more common sense theory than evolutionary Darwinism is. But punctuated equilibrium says that things are going to stay the same until there's a reason to change. You see, the fossil record actually does not support this continual, gradual change in species. They don't find missing links. Okay, what they find is that a species dies out, goes extinct, and there's another species, which was their repressive species, which then becomes dominant. And the reason for that is because there was some sort of environmental change that caused that to happen. Things are not going to change in this country until we reach a crisis. That's the thing. I mean, we all think that things are going to continually to go, blah. What's going to happen is we're going to reach a point where that's not sustainable anymore. And when that happens, that is our moment. That's when we have the chance to really have a huge impact. Because what we have been doing for the past, I don't know, almost since the Constitution was ratified way back in the day, is we have moved away from the things that have made America great: individual freedom and the free enterprise system. And it ain't going to work. $34.5 trillion in national debt ain't going to work. So that's the thing. When the crisis happens, are we going to be ready to take advantage of that? See, everything runs in cycles. Okay, one of my favorite books is called The Fourth Turning, and it talks about how you go through these cycles, and history is cyclical, and there is a crisis, and it's existential, and we've seen this throughout American history, and they happen about every 80 years. The last one was World War II. How long ago was World War II? 80 years ago. So that's what we're looking at, is we're looking at a huge crisis, but then out of that, we're looking at a rebirth of America. It's up to us to determine if it's going to be positive or if it's going to be negative. And it's going to be positive because I have faith in you, and I've seen all these organizations and the great work that they do. So please, please keep it up. Above all else, do not lose hope, and do not think that what you're doing isn't important. When I was here in 2008, I remember apologize, her name slips me, but from the Advocates for Self-Government, Sharon Harris. Miss Harris said, and this sounds melancholy, not melancholy, melodramatic, but it's true. Libertarians are going to be the saviors of Western civilization. And it is absolutely true. What you all do is important, whatever organization you work for. We're going to change the world. We have to be ready when we get that opportunity. Thank you all very much.